Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Hachette Australia. Listeners, I'm super lucky to be in the position to interview today an Aussie author who's been on my radar for quite some time. Her 2022 debut novel, Wake, was a top 5 bestseller. It's been published in the US and the UK as well as here in Australia. It won the CWA Debut Dagger Award in 2019, a UK award for an unpublished writer. It was shortlisted for the Indie Book Awards Debut Novel Award, the Kill Your Darlings Unpublished Manuscript Award, and the Bath Novel Award. This author also won the ARBIA's 2023 Matt Ritchell Award for New Writer of the Year. In addition, Wake has been shortlisted for the 2023 Ned Kelley Award for Best Debut Crime Fiction. I am, of course, talking about Shelley Burr. Shelley grew up between Newcastle's beaches and her grandparents' property in Glenrowan. When Shelley isn't writing, she's setting up a small permaculture farm while studying agriculture at the University of New England. And shortly, Shelley's brand new novel, Ripper, will be published by Hachette Australia. A clever, twisty novel set in a tiny town between Sydney and Melbourne, a town long past its heyday and struggling under the weight of its dark history. As with all the very best crime novels, listeners, I was hooked from its opening page. Now, if you loved Shelley's first book, Wake, then Ripper is a must-read, but equally compelling as a standalone. Just fabulous. So welcome to the podcast, Shelley.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here.
You've really had a busy few years, haven't you?
Yes, I certainly have. It's all taken me a bit by surprise. It's still a bit weird to hear people refer to me as having a writing career now. Last year when I was promoting Wake, I had written a book, and now it's an entire career, and it's still feels a little bit surreal to me.
I can only imagine. But Shelley, like many of the writers I've interviewed on this podcast, they've had various backgrounds and incredibly diverse paths to publication, and so have you. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how you came to writing and what was your first big break.
Absolutely. So I've always loved writing as something for me. So it was, my preferred art form and something that I could quite easily sit down and just have a little bit of time for myself and just work on whatever was in my head. I never really expected to write as a career or write at this level. It's always the daydream that you'll end up as a published writer, but I was really quite content just to write for myself and to enjoy the process. My primary career before this, I trained as an accountant and I worked in the public service. So very different world. And then writing would just be my time after work, and then as I started a family, it would be after bedtime once everything was quiet, I would go to my desk and that would be my hobby essentially. And so then when I got the idea for Wake, and it really grabbed me really fast, like I sat down and I wrote the first draft about the first 30,000 words in just this mad rush to get it out of my head and onto the page because it was scaring me almost. Like, it's quite a dark idea. And so, I was wanting to put it out there onto the page. And then as it went on, I sort of started to think that maybe I did have something here that, was a little bit more fully formed than anything I'd worked on before. We used to have a really wonderful program in the ACT run through the Writers' Centre that's now named Marion. It was called Hard Copy. It was a manuscript development program that ran over the course of a year. And so we would all come together as a group and work on it. And that was a really amazing experience and was the first time that anybody ever really talked to me, assuming that professional writing was in my future. And so that really changed things for me. And then I had a finished draft of Wake, and I didn't feel ready to send it out to publishers and to start getting rejections, essentially. And so a good in-between was to try Unpublished Manuscript Awards, which is how I ended up submitting it to the CWA Debut Daggers, which, when you send out to an award, if you don't win, you don't get a no in the mail, you just don't win. And so that felt safe. So I sent that out and I got longlisted. And I remember saying to my husband, well, long listing, that's amazing. Like, I've got that forever. I can put that in my bio. It's not blank anymore. That's all I ever wanted. And then it got shortlisted, and then it won. And I was just completely blown away. The thing about the CWA Debut Dagger is that it is really highly regarded. And so from there, I still didn't feel like Wake was ready for publication. So I did start to get some interest then. People reached out to me because, it does get your name out there, but I didn't feel like it was ready to go out yet. And I, took it and I did a few more passes and worked on it, and then started to look for agents. And so I found that the Debut Dagger, it would definitely get people to sit up and take notice. I would go to things like the Australian Society of Authors pitching events, and I could see as soon as that came out, like the whole demeanor changed. But the manuscript still has to stand on its own, even with an award attached to it. When I queried some agents, is that it would get it looked at really fast, but that just meant that I would get a no in 2 weeks instead of 3 months. And so that was great, but the manuscript still had to stand on its own. Nobody's going to buy a manuscript that's not there yet, just because it does have this award that they can put on the cover. And when I did find the right agent for me, that's Sarah Mackenzie, who I did meet through one of those ASA pitching events. They're really great. And so once I signed with her, she started sending it out to publishers. And from there, things happened really quickly. We got interest from 3 publishers quite quickly. And from there, it was an auction process. And so I got to choose which of those 3 publishers I felt was the right home for it, which was a real privilege, because I got to talk to all of the different editors, hear their visions for it, figure out what would be the right fit. And it was a really difficult decision, but I feel really blessed that I was able to be in that position. And from there, it's been beyond anything I ever imagined, even in the daydreams. It really has been an amazing 1.5 years, or however long it's been, 2 years.
That is so fantastic, Shelley. And yeah, absolute congratulations to you. So how are you juggling your writing with your farming pursuits at the moment?
Well, it's like this. If the sun's out, I'm farming. And if it's dark, I'm writing. I mean, it doesn't always work out precisely like that. It's a little bit seasonal. There's obviously always going to be periods where the writing is really intense. And from that, I'm really lucky to have great support around me, help with getting things done, or my husband stepping up more with our daughter so that I've got more time to write. And then other times things are a little bit quieter with me, so I can do more of the family stuff or more of the farming stuff. It's going to be an interesting challenge heading into this period, because Ripper is going to come out on the last day of winter. So I'm going to be in the heavy promotional period, right in that early spring period where I really probably should be getting the farm chores done. But, Ripper does have to take priority as well. It's almost like I've gotten things backwards, is that I write for a living and I farm as a hobby.
Even though Ripper is about to be released, I feel like we can't talk about it in any great depth without mentioning Wake. And I know that you've talked a little bit about it. The books are standalone, but connected in some ways. Can you tell me how you got the idea for Wake?
Yeah, I didn't set out to write crime fiction or go searching for ideas for a crime fiction novel. There was a period where I was reading a lot of true crime forums, which feature really heavily in Wake as a plot point. And they were just these fascinating spaces where people would gather to discuss unsolved mysteries, disappearances, murders, unidentified remains. And it was just really fascinating reading, because they would just gather to pull together all of the available information. They would throw around theories. They sometimes accomplished some really incredible things. There are forums that have fundraised to have DNA tests performed on Jane Does and anything else that I might critique in the true crime space. That the work that gets done to identify unidentified remains is really important, and I really respect it. And as I was reading this, I just started to get more and more uncomfortable, that creeping sense of unease about the way that people on these forums talked about the friends and families of murder victims. Because in true crime, those are the prime suspects. But if they're not the killer, they're grieving innocent people. And so it's always a really difficult ethical line to walk, of those are the people that detectives need to look at closely. But that is a really traumatic thing to have happen to you on top of the horrific trauma of losing a loved one in a really terrible way. And I was reading one particular exchange about the brother of a murder victim. And they were like, oh, yeah, he doesn't really have much of an online presence. I can't find much information about what he's up to today. He doesn't have a Facebook. He doesn't have an Instagram. He does have a LinkedIn. So I know where he works, and they have a Facebook page. So I looked at the Facebook page of the employer and I found their Christmas party photos. And I was just sitting there being all like, oh, if that was me and these complete strangers were like running that level of interrogation into you just trying to live your normal life, I would be so angry. And that anger really inspired the character of Mina. Like, that's what I wanted to explore as a person who was in that position and how that would play out. And so that's why I originally wrote Wake as crime fiction, because I wanted to explore that idea. That being the case, it became a murder mystery, and a lot of the other aspects of the story unrolled from, okay, so if this is what I want to tell, what do the other elements have to be? And, that develops the character of Lane and the setting and the story from there.
Do you think that the success of Wake made writing your second book easier or harder?
I think that there were ups and downs to it. Writing Wake was very much just something I was doing for myself. Like, it was about 4 years that I was working on it, and I never had any obligations to anybody except myself. Like, sometimes there were deadlines for like hard copy and that sort of thing, but it was just my thing. I didn't ever know if anybody else would ever read it. I didn't have to write conscious of how people might react to it. Whereas with Ripper, it was a really different experience, because I knew right from the very first word on the page that it would one day be on shelves and it would probably be read by quite a lot of people. That was different going into it 100% knowing that this was destined for publication. But I really tried very hard to set aside what I knew about how people had reacted to Wake and what expectations I know people have about what a second book may or may not provide for them. I've had some people do seem to think that Ripper will answer unanswered questions from Wake, which is not the case. It's not a sequel, it's standalone. You could read them in either order, is the intention. Certainly there would be a lot you would get out of reading both of them. It's not intended to just clean up the loose ends from Wake.
So for the benefit of listeners who haven't yet read Ripper, could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, certainly. Ripper it's the story of a small town, Rainier, which once was fairly successful as one of those places that you stop for a cup of coffee and a hot pie on your way to somewhere else. So it used to be this very lovely, bustling town that has gone very much into economic decline and is starting to really question if it has any future at all, or if it is eventually going to fold entirely. Being such a small town, if anybody outside of the town has heard its name, it's because of one thing. And that was because of a series of horrific murders that happened over the course of a couple of weeks, about 15 years ago. So the people of the town are presented with a really difficult choice, which is that a tour company wants to capitalize on that little bit of infamy the town has and start running tours of the murder sites, which will bring people in, and those people will, come, they'll spend money, they'll buy a cup of coffee and a hot pie again, and the town can rebuild on that. But the people of the town are the friends and family of those who were lost to the murders, or at the very least know how awful it is to be the friends and family of the people. So it's that question of, do we cash in on this, knowing that if we don't, then we don't really have any other options, or do we hold firm? And before they have to make that decision, the tour operator is killed in a way very reminiscent of the first of the Rainier Ripper murders. So now they have potentially a copycat killer on the loose.
Yeah, indeed. An absolutely fascinating story and fascinating premise. So it got me wondering, where did the idea for this book come from?
I have to be really cautious in how I speak about it, because I don't want to create the impression that I've based anything that happens in Ripper on any real cases or real events. It's fully fictional, and it's really important to me to always put out books that are fully fictional because I don't want to appropriate too much from the real pain of real people. But the spark of the idea came when I was reading an ABC News article about the town of Snowtown. Anyone in Australia, on hearing the word Snowtown, immediately thinks of one thing, which is the Snowtown serial killings, the bodies in the barrels case. This article was just talking about the people who still live in Snowtown and their experience with that reputation, and the questions in the town of, do we embrace the people that come here purely because of the reputation this town has, or do we try to rebrand and move away from it and try to let that darker part of our history fade from people's consciousness? Like even, the question of potentially entirely changing the name of the town. And whenever I'm researching, I'm just looking for somebody in the story or a group of people in the story that I really empathize with. So that really jumped out at me as people in a really interesting situation that I wanted to explore a bit more. So from that starting point, I, came up with a town that was in very much the same situation. But, the town is not in any way based on Snowtown. The murders aren't based on the events of Snowtown. The town itself, it's halfway between Melbourne and Sydney. So there is a real place in that spot, Tarcutta, New South Wales, which is a beautiful little town. But Rainier is fictional. As with the town that Wake is set in, I didn't really want to take a real place and layer a dark history over the top of it. So It is a fictional place, but very much based on Tarcutta.
That was something I was going to ask you, because you do say that Rainier is like the midpoint between Sydney and Melbourne, but it's not actually the midpoint.
There is a real town there. Yes, in this universe, maybe Tarcutta doesn't exist and they built Rainier there instead. I don't know.
Indeed. Now, the issue of a bypass around a thriving town is often a matter of considerable community debate. Highway shops and businesses, once must-stop places, often become defunct once a bypass goes in. So how important was this to Rainier and the events of this novel? And was this something you consciously wanted to explore?
It's always been a big issue. Like, I remember that there was a town near us when I was growing up that experienced basically the exact same thing, is that there was a proposed bypass and it was going to shave maybe half an hour off the trip, but it was going to destroy an entire town. And so it was a big debate of, is it really, you look at the other side and half an hour adds up to quite a lot when you consider the movement of trucks and goods and, just the flow of traffic. And I would hope that these questions become less important over time as road traffic becomes de-emphasized. And we're starting to see other ideas come up now, like here near us, there's the old railways being turned into bike trails. And so maybe they're not getting the car traffic flow through anymore, but they're finding new ways to reuse those spaces and still continue to bring people in. Like in the book, the idea behind the tourism idea is people aren't going to travel all that way just to see this tour, but all you need to do is to convince people to put their blinker on. Like, take the exit, come see the town again, stop in on your way somewhere else. And, certainly in some towns, they're doing better than ever. Like if you look at Glenrowan, for example, which is an absolute beautiful space and is a great example of turning dark tourism to your benefit, because they're building on the Ned Kelley history and the interest that people have in coming to see those original spaces. But also there's a distance there from what actually happened. There's nobody still around who is personally affected and might be hurt by that decision.
Gemma was a fascinating character, I thought, as were so many of the other characters in this book. But in Gemma's case, much of her adult life has been defined by the gruesome nature of the crimes that rocked the town of Rainier 17 years earlier. Can you tell me about your decision to make Gemma one of your two protagonists? And did you always know that the story would be told from her point of view?
I think that Gemma is a really interesting character because Gemma is the point of view character, but she is not necessarily the most active character in the book. And this was really tricky to balance. This was probably one of the hardest nuts to crack during the drafting process, is how to balance Gemma's position as often just an observer of what was happening, versus trying to make her as active as possible and not just passively watching what was going on around her. Gemma is the only character in the story who can tell the story, because she is the only person who sees everything that happens. But she's not always the most active participant at certain parts of the story. So that was certainly very tricky, but I don't think it could have been anyone else. And I knew right from the beginning that it was going to be Gemma that was going to be the point of view character, because that first scene in the story, which it does open with a prologue in which Gemma is just experiencing, it's set in the past, and experiencing what it's like to live in a town that's under the shadow of this kind of random violence. Her mother gives her an Anne Rule book about Ted Bundy, and trying to, the way that women are taught that it's their role to prevent violence from happening to them. And so she's conscious of this stuff. And then somebody bangs on the door, and she actively makes the decision not to open the door because she considers herself to be in danger. And so that decision and how it would affect a person, mild spoilers just for the first prologue, but the person banging on the door is in fact a murder victim trying to find help, and she doesn't open the door until she feels safe to do so. And so she then lives the rest of her life wondering if those few minutes might have made a difference. That was the core of the story to me. And so it really did have to be Gemma as that person who made that decision. And from there, a lot of other decisions flow from that. Maybe she's not even conscious that that was the cause and effect, but she certainly had to be the main character to me.
What an interesting thought process. Yeah, as you said, she certainly does have a unique perspective on the town, and she's very observant, but there's also lots that she doesn't know.
Exactly. And that was really fascinating as well, because a lot of the characters, when there is important information that you don't know, you're living in a completely different reality from the people who do have that key piece of information. And that was so fun to play with as a writer. It's always good to write things in a way that if somebody flipped back to the first page and started again, they would have a different experience, because there would be things that are suddenly very obvious that a first-time reader could never have picked up on.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that about this book. So many crime novels explore the idea of small town secrets, and you've done that in Ripper with exceptional finesse. And I think what I found so fascinating with this book was the idea that you can know people your entire life and yet never really know them. Was that something you specifically wanted to explore, or was that something that just came out during the writing?
I would say it came out during the writing. The small town secrets thing, it's so it's a trope that I love. And I think it's probably like the fundamental trope of this kind of crime fiction. And there are people who will hear those 3 words and they're gone. Like, no, not interested. I'm writing for the people who hear those words and lean in. And I almost wanted to take that trope and turn it up to 11. Like, there is so much going on here that in some ways, the only reason some of these people are getting away with what they are is because everybody else is so focused on what they're trying to get away with that they don't even notice what everyone else is up to.
Yeah.
And that was really what I wanted to play with.
Shelley, I think it's fair to say that it's not just the town that has suffered as a result of the trio of murders all those years before, but the people of the town suffered as well. You can see it in Gemma and Hugh and in their relationship. You can see it in the parents and the families left behind, as well as the people who found or encountered the deceased victims. So I wanted to ask you, how did you get into the mindset of these grieving survivors? And did you have any specific trauma-related research that you needed to do?
Absolutely. If you look at almost every character in any of my books is in some way traumatized and expressing that in some way. And some of the characters, they actually have an active diagnosis that they know and understand that they're living with post-traumatic stress disorder or generalized anxiety. And others, maybe aren't as aware of it, but everybody is in some way traumatized. And I did feel an obligation to try and be as accurate as I could in how I was presenting that. So I did put a lot of research into trauma reactions, and I just found that a very interesting avenue to read about as well. And I had I had an odd sort of experience that when I was writing Wake, I knew that these characters were traumatized and I wanted to be accurate. And so I wrote Wake, and then I went away and did a lot of reading about PTSD and trauma and how it manifests, just to make sure that I was on the right track. And what I found was that most of what I've found in the research was already in some way represented in the characters. I didn't change anything as a result of that research. But what I did notice was that some of those symptoms felt very familiar. And I was like, oh, I do that. So I think that probably one of the reasons that trauma is so interesting to me and something that I want to explore in the work is my own experience. I actually was diagnosed with PTSD in between writing Wake and writing Ripper. And it wasn't because I had that moment of, oh, hey, that's a bit familiar, but it wasn't a huge surprise to me when like my doctor raised it, because I had noticed that some of this stuff was chiming with me. And trauma, it manifests in so many different ways, and characters, people react to it in often wildly different ways, with that behavior still having the same source. I can put 10 different characters who are traumatized or have PTSD into a story and have them behave in 10 completely different ways. And that's been something that's great to explore, even moving from Wake to Ripper. If you compare the character of Mina and how she reacts to trauma to Gemma and how she reacts, is that it's basically they're opposites to each other, so much so that they're almost similar. Mina is anxious and troubled, and so she retreats. She wants to be in her safe space. She doesn't want to deal with other people. She doesn't want to deal with the intrusion, and so she flees from it and lives her life as separate from the rest of the world as she can. And Gemma has almost responded to her trauma by throwing herself so wholesale into other people that she almost doesn't exist as a separate person. She's a wife, she's a mother, she's a friend, she's running this business because she feels an obligation to her family to keep it afloat. And that was really interesting to explore, moving from one to the other.
I'm sorry to hear that you were diagnosed with PTSD. I hope that you're okay.
I am okay. And it's a good thing. Like, you know, sometimes it's a lot better than living with it and not knowing. And I think that there's a lot of people out there that have it and don't know. That's why they find things so hard. Yeah. So like, I think it's a good thing that I got a diagnosis. I'm really happy about it. It's a weird thing to say, but.
So Shelley, what about the police procedural aspects of the book? I mean, there's clearly lots about this book that fascinated me, but one of the more intriguing topics was of confessions and why someone might confess to a crime they didn't commit. So can you talk to me about the read technique and why it's no longer used as an interviewing technique by Australian police?
Yeah, so there is a really wonderful book that I mention in the acknowledgements of Ripper. The title alone is probably a fairly big spoiler, but it is a really wonderful book that raises some really important points about human beings and how they react. Because being interrogated by the police is an intensely stressful process. And the funny thing about really high impact, high pressure interrogation techniques is that they actually are more effective at inducing false confessions from innocent people than they are from inducing confessions from people who actually are in fact guilty. Because innocent people think they can trust the police, and because it's the truth and they didn't do it, then like one way that you can end up with miscarriages of justice with the read technique is that they might be induced to confess to something that's not quite as bad as the worst possible interpretation. And there have been some cases of people confessing because they know they didn't do it, so the interrogation is, you know, really high pressure and really stressful. And it feels like the only way out of that room is to confess. And they know that they didn't do it, so surely the evidence will exonerate them. But the research actually shows that human beings really can't move past a confession. If the evidence absolutely definitively clears someone who has confessed, like, we really can't deal with that. Like, often if that does happen, then the prosecutors will just find a different explanation that allows both. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I really recommend that people do go out and research this a little bit and hear this story told by the experts, because I'm probably making a hash of it. But even if a person confesses and then, like, the DNA evidence shows that it must have been someone else, the fingerprint evidence, well, okay, there were two killers. Like, so I think it's in something like 20% of killers or criminals exonerated by the Innocence Project, they actually confessed to the crime. It's really quite horrific how common it is. Even in some cases, like, there have been recorded cases of people becoming quite so confused during the interrogation process, this really high pressure, high stress, that they think maybe they did do it. Like, you know, we all think that that can't happen. Like, really, it blows people's minds. But, you know, that it happens in, like, studies run by universities, that they know this person didn't commit the crime because they've set up this study to, like, you know, falsely accuse them, and they still successfully get confessions out of people for a crime that never happened. It's really fascinating stuff, and really important that people know about it, you know, because of that assumption that a confession is the end of the story and you can just breathe a sigh of relief. Okay, no matter what questions there are hanging over it, they confessed. So we know it's done and dusted. And, like, maybe even that isn't completely reliable.
Absolutely mind-blowing stuff. Yeah, you mentioned the Innocence Project, and I think that does really highlight and spotlight this massive problem we have. It obviously gives some short-term relief to victims' families and police. You know, they can put a full stop at the end of that investigation, but it really does have such wide-ranging and catastrophic consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, even the peace technique is certainly a much better technique for interrogation, but it's still interrogation. So, you know, if you are taken to speak to the police, don't say anything, get a lawyer. That's my advice.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, this book is connected to Wake in a small way via the character of Lane Holland. Tell me about him, and was it always your intention to involve him in this book as well?
No, but when I first started to think about Ripper, I hadn't sold Wake yet, but I was starting to think, okay, you know, it is time to maybe think about another project. Like, you know, maybe Wake isn't ever going to sell, and it would be good to have a second option in the drawer. So I was thinking about it in those terms, of that I didn't want them to be tightly tied together, because that would require Wake, then Ripper to be the order that things came out in. And, you know, maybe Ripper was going to be the first book. Who knows? I think that if you want advice, if you're an emerging author, I really think that people who do go into the publishing process already with a second book in the back pocket probably have a much better experience. So when I was in the initial planning stages, I did think about having him in there. And I wasn't sure, was I just retreating to the familiar? Was it just easier to write in a voice that I was already so familiar with, that I'd already got nailed down? It was noticeably easier to write Lane's chapters than Gemma's, because Gemma was a new voice and I was still figuring her out as I was going. You know, I didn't know when I was writing it what kind of reaction people would have to Lane. Like, maybe people wouldn't want to see him again. And so for a little while in the very beginning, I was trying to play it both ways, that maybe this was a storyline that didn't need to be there. And that's quite funny to look back on now, because Ripper, by the end, it was so deeply braided into the story that if I had cut that plot out, it would be a completely different book and would go a completely different way.
Yeah.
And so, very much now he must be in there. He has to be in the story. It doesn't work otherwise. But in the early days, when it was still in the planning, I was like, well, maybe I'll write it in a way that, if I don't feel it's working, that could be cut out and I could go a different direction. But I am really glad that I included him. I think that it's a much stronger book for having his voice in there.
Yeah, indeed. I do too. He was a fascinating character, which kind of got me thinking and feeling from the end of this book that we might encounter Lane again. Is there a third book featuring Lane on the horizon?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's interesting that that writing Ripper, I wasn't really sure which way I was going to go with it. Whereas this one, it's very absolutely, definitely. Book 3 will be a Lane book. Lane has been in both of the previous books as a fairly major character, but I think book 3 would be the one where I really dig into him and maybe make him look internally at some of the stuff that he has been deliberately not looking at and come to terms with some things. So it definitely would be a Lane-centric book, to the point where he might be the only point of view character. I haven't decided yet.
Yeah, fascinating. Because I think by the end of this book, he was certainly starting to think about his situation a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think that he has been a laser-focused person for so much of his life. He was just trying to achieve one thing. And I don't think it ever occurred to him that there might be something beyond that. Like, once he'd accomplished this central goal of his life, he was going to have to figure out what to do next. And then he accomplished that goal in a way that, he maybe didn't need to figure out what to do next. And now he's waking up to the fact that there is a morning after, and there is going to continue to be mornings after. And one day he will have to figure out what he is going to do next. And so that's what that third book would be looking at.
Can't wait to see what you do with that. Shelley, you alluded to it a little bit earlier. You gave one writerly tip just a few moments ago. But I mean, Shelley, there are a lot of writers who listen to this podcast, and given your incredible experiences and achievements to date, do you have any other tips for writers out there looking for that first big break or publishing deal?
Look, it's really tough. Like, I still don't really know what the secret is, even having gotten to publication and gotten to the second book and found a readership. I still really don't know how one goes about doing that. I think it's half hard work and half good luck. And I've certainly had a lot of good luck. So the only part of it that you can control is the hard work part. So for anybody who is still trying to get there, one of the most important things is to find a community, join your local writers center, try to find other writers in your area. Like, I had a group of writers that we used to, back in the heyday of 2019, we used to meet at a place called Tilly's Divine Cafe in Canberra, and we would write together. And that was just a really great way to keep ourselves on track and also keep in touch with each other about what was going on. And, some people would move ahead and be able to tell us what that part of the process looked like. And if an opportunity came up that seemed maybe good, maybe not great, feeling a bit strange about it, then it was really great to have that group of people that we could take something to and be like, hey, what do you think about this? Like, if you're building that community of writers, then, that's a great thing just on its own. Even if it doesn't lead to publication or something else, then at least what you've got is a beautiful community of people who love the same thing. And that's wonderful too.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Shelley. So if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
In social media, I'm most active on Instagram, which is Shelley Burr Writes. I have a Facebook page by the same name. I do have my own website, shelleyburr.com.au. That's got a little bit of information about upcoming books. You can sign up for the newsletter. There'll will be information about events, that sort of thing. So that's probably the best place to find me.
And I understand that you're having a launch in Albury.
I am. It's coming up really fast now. So yeah, we have a wonderful Dimmicks here in Albury. They've been really supportive and they have really great events. So it should be a really great night. And we have a lovely writers festival as well, right around the Murray, which is taking place from the 13th of September. So coming up really fast. And that is just an amazing event.
Well, Shelley, it's been such a joy to chat with you today about your new book, Ripper, a fascinating, gripping read I highly recommend to all crime fiction lovers. I wish you every success with it, and thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Thank you very much.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.